Thank you. Okay, so moving on to indices, but a much, much harder version of indices. We are looking at negative and fractional indices. So, going to look at 5 separate skills here that we need. Number 1, negative powers. If you have something like 5 to the negative 3, first thing we must remember with negative powers is just the idea of flipping it. Okay, so 5 to the negative 3 means 1 over 5 to the power 3. The negative just means to flip it, and we'll see that in a moment in more detail. We know that 5 cubed is 125. Okay, so that will become 1 over 125. You might have something like 2 to the power minus 4. Remember, that means to flip it. So this becomes 1 over 2 to the power 4. 2 to the power 4, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. It's 16. 1 over 16. So our first thing here is that when we see the negative, that means to flip things. Let's see how that works with fractions, where we look at powers of fractions. For example, if we do 2/3 and we square it, the most important thing to know here is that when you're squaring a fraction, that you square the numerator and you square the denominator. So this is equivalent to 2 squared over 3 squared. That's therefore 4 over 9. You may also get a negative fraction, a negative power of a fraction. So imagine, for example, you had something like 3 over 7 to the power minus 2. You are dealing with two things there. You're dealing with the fact that it's a fraction, and you're dealing with the fact that it's got a negative power. Now remember from negative powers a moment ago, negative powers mean flip it. So to flip 3 over 7, it becomes 7 over 3. The power 2 is still there. The negative part we dealt with meant flip it. We flipped it. So it's now 7 over 3 to the power 2. Remember now that the power of 2 operates on the numerator and the denominator. So this is 7 squared over 3 squared, which is 49 over 9. So we've seen what happens when we have negative powers. We've seen what happens when we're working with fractions. We've seen what happens if you have a negative power of a fraction. The other thing that comes up a lot is you'll be asked to find the reciprocal. Now reciprocal means something to the power minus 1. That's one of the meanings of reciprocal. So you need to recognize reciprocal meaning to the power minus 1. So if they asked you for the reciprocal of 7, that's 7 to the minus 1, which is 1 over 7. If they ask you for the reciprocal of 2/3, the reciprocal means to the power minus 1. We must commit this to memory. So we're talking about 2/3 to the minus 1. And we know that means flip it. So this becomes 3 over 2. Sometimes they could be really sneaky and give you a decimal. So they give you the reciprocal of 0.4. So what are we going to do? We can't flip that. So we could look at 0.4 as a fraction. Isn't that 4 over 10? True? 4/10, 0.4. So what's 4/10 to the minus 1? Well, we know reciprocal means the power minus 1. We know the power minus 1 means flip it. To flip 4 over 10 becomes 10 over 4. Can we simplify 10 over 4? 10 over 4 is 5 over 2. The question was written as a decimal. Let's write our answer as a decimal. 5 over 2, 2.5. So that's when you see the word reciprocal. It'll be worth 1 mark, but it'll be there as a gift to you in either higher or foundation. So reciprocal, really important. Now we move into fractional powers. Let's look at an example of a fractional power. Eight to the power 1/3. The simple fact about fractional powers is this. The denominator comes down to be the root. The numerator goes up to be the power. Simple fact to remember for our revision. So the 3 comes down, becomes the cube root of 8. The power goes up. So we're talking about the cube root of 8 to the power 1. Now we know the cube root of 8 is 2 because 2 cubed is 8. So it's 2 to the power 1. And we know from earlier that powers of 1, the number stays the same. So this is 2. Let's look at another example. Let's look at something like 9 to the 3 over 2. The fractional power. Really nice way of remembering it is that the denominator, the bottom of the fraction, comes down. The top goes up. That's all we have to do. The 2 comes down, the 3 goes up. As long as you remember that, you're going to be really successful with these questions. So the 2 comes down. That becomes the square root of 9. And the numerator goes up 3. We do what's inside the bracket first. The square root of 9, we know, is 3. We now need to do 3 cubed. 3 times 3 times 3, 27. And that's how our fractional powers work. The denominator comes down, the numerator goes up. And that leaves us finally in this revision, negative fractional powers. So, let's take a look at some examples of those. Negative fractional powers. Let's start with something simple. 16 to the minus 1/2. You're having to combine 2 separate rules together here. 1 dealing with negative powers, and 2 dealing with fractional powers. The first thing we deal with is the negative. We know negative means flip it. So we can change this to 1 over 16 to the power 1/2. We know that the denominator comes down. We know that the numerator goes up. We also know that if we are working with powers of a fraction, we do the power to the top and to the bottom. So this was going to be 1 to the power 1/2 over 16 to the power 1/2. It's doing, this power is working on the top and it's also working on the bottom. This fractional power, remember, the denominator comes down, the numerator goes up. The denominator comes down, the numerator goes up. So here we're talking about the square root of 1 to the power 1. And on the bottom we're talking about the square root of 16 to the power 1. For the numerator, we know the square root of 1 is 1, and 1 to the power 1 is 1. For the denominator, we know the square root of 16 is 4, and 4 to the power 1 is 4. So we get the final answer. Let's look at another one. Let's look at something like 25 to the minus 3 over 2. It's a scary looking question, but let's follow the same process. The first thing we're going to deal with is the fact that it's a negative power. And we know negative means flip it. So we flip the 25. It becomes 1 over 25. That has dealt with the negative part of the power. So now it's positive 3 over 2 that we're dealing with. First step, 1 mark. Next step, we know that this power that's operating on the fraction operates on the numerator, so that's 1 to the 3 over 2, and it also acts on the denominator, that's 25 to the 3 over 2. Our final thing now is to deal with those fractional indices. We know that the denominator of the power comes down to be the root and that the numerator goes up to be the power. We know that the denominator comes down to be the root. We know that the numerator goes up to be the power. This means that on the top we have the square root of 1 to the power 3. On the bottom we have the square root of 25 to the power 3. And now we can work these out. The square root of 1 is 1. 1 cubed is 1. The numerator was nice and simple. On the denominator, the square root of 25 is 5. 5 cubed is 125. So we have a final answer. Finally, let's look at a fraction. Let's look at a fraction like 8 over 27. Let's have that fraction with a negative power. Let's make that power fractional itself. In this case, let's make it 2 over 3. So we've got a fraction as the base, we've got a fraction as the power, and that power is negative. This is the ultimate level of difficulty on these types of questions. But we can do this. We know that the first thing we do is deal with the negative power. Negative means flip it. It now becomes 27 over 8. The power stays the same. It goes from being negative 2/3 to 2/3. The power doesn't flip. Some people make a mistake there. The negative power means flip the base, keep the rest as it is. So now we know it's going to operate on the top and the bottom. So we have 27 to the 2/3 over 8 to the 2/3. We know with fractional powers the denominator comes down to be the root. The numerator goes up to be the power. So on the top we have the cube root of 27. Numerator becomes the power, to the power 2. On the bottom we have the 3 comes down, the cube root of 8. The numerator goes up, squared. Now let's look at what's inside the bracket. The cube root of 27. We know that's 3 because 3 cubed is 27. So this becomes 3. Don't forget it's still being squared. On the bottom, we know the cube root of 8 is 2 because 2 cubed is 8. So this inside the brackets becomes 2. Don't forget it's still to the power 2. For a final step on the numerator, 3 to the power 2 is 9. On the denominator, 2 squared is 4. Our final answer is 9 over 4. You need lots of practice to get sharp at this. In a moment I'm going to hand you a sheet that you can take away to practice.